Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to the fourth podcast brought to you by the Critical Sport Network, a collaboration between scholars in the UK and Taiwan, supported by the Taiwan Ministry of Science and Technology, which I believe now has a new name, and the Economic and Social Research Council. I'm delighted to have with me today Ren-Shiang Jiang from the National Taiwan University of Sport and Stuart Whigham from Oxford Brookes University in the UK, who in the course of the development of our network have probably come up with the most interesting, or one of the most interesting initiatives, which is to look at the relationship between sport policy and politics in Scotland and in Taiwan. We'll see in a moment or two how comparative that approach is and what similarities and differences have emerged. But first of all, welcome to you both, Ren-Shiang and Stuart. And can I ask Ren-Shiang, first of all, about your previous work on sport policy in Taiwan?
Okay, thank you, Alan. Yeah, for my previous work in terms of Taiwan's policy, I think my interest is sports governance and policy evaluation, such as the sports for all policy, to see its implementation and outcomes. So I did a little bit criticize and recommend what the government can do in the future, and I think that's why I link my research with policy learning and practice. Specifically, I think we learn something from so-called sport excellent countries or nations, for elite level. So I also did some research for Chinese Taipei Olympic Committee about learning the winning medal strategy from the Team GB. So also for participation level, I did study for Research Council in Taiwan about the overall sports promotion policy in England and Scotland.
Okay, thanks. So a number of things that will come up as we proceed with Sport for All on one hand, and of course the pursuit of medals in international events. Stuart, what about you? Your background, obviously, in large part has been involved in looking at sport policy and politics in Scotland.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation to the podcast. So my own kind of interest in this starts from my PhD, which is looking at the 2014 Commonwealth Games and how that was tied in to one, the kind of events hosting policy of the Scottish Government, but also how it was linked to the politics of the Scottish independence referendum, which was closely aligned with that period of time. So I guess my interest has always been, yes, policy, but also the political leveraging of sport for particular ends. So that was the main kind of driver, looking at how the SNP, the kind of pro-independence government, were trying to frame the games against the pro-union parties who were trying to kind of look against or challenge against the SNP's push for independence. I kind of branched off from that to look also at the relationships between that and Scottishness and Britishness in the Olympic Games and how that's been wrapped up in terms of different policy positions. A little bit of work with Sport Scotland on equality, diversity, inclusion type policy. Sport Scotland being the kind of the arm's length organisation which is given the funding to almost enact sport policy on behalf of the Scottish Government, which is one of the kind of nuances compared to Taiwan, which we'll maybe unpick later on. So yeah, I think I've been interested in it more from the politics side than the policy side, but you can't really separate the two.
Okay, thanks, Stuart. Now, Ren-Shiang, you mentioned the name of Scotland towards the end of your first answer. So what attracted you to doing work in Scotland, and what sort of research have you done so far?
I think, first of all, I have to say, since I studied in Loughborough, I realized it's not just the United Kingdom. I mean, I realized that UK is not equal to England, so all the nations within the UK are quite different. So I think that in Taiwan, the development country policy are focus of Taiwan's policy research. Among them, the United Kingdom always been the target of policy learning in my country, in Taiwan, because of Team GB's performance in international competitions, and also I think for the development of the domestic sport development, such as Premier League. So, however, I think what I found is that past sports research, when referring to the study for United Kingdom, is always put emphasis on England. But as for Scotland, there has been a record of sporting achievement consistent with the size of population. Although the status of Taiwan and Scotland is not quite the same, but I think interesting comparison can be made with reference to them, two countries or two nations. They often in the shadow of their closest neighbor, I mean England and China, with whom there is, I think, uneasy political relationship, and some, I think, of course, economic relationship. Yeah, so that's why I try to not just to look at England, but also think about the comparison between, or I think seek the similarity between Taiwan and Scotland.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Now, Stuart, I suppose your trajectory is slightly different. I mean, I wonder to what extent were you a bit like me, that you knew that there's such a place as Taiwan and it's a significant place, but you hadn't presumably studied it until you became involved in this collaboration.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think there's lots of similarities in terms of what you mentioned there. You kind of, it's like when you're younger and you watch the Olympics and you kind of see these nations and, well, why is that called this rather than called that? And obviously with Taiwan, there's the intricacies around the naming in the Olympics and the status of Taiwan within there. So you kind of pick up these little things when you're younger, but they're just, I guess, things you don't really get too much knowledge around until you kind of emerge into academia. And then I became aware when I kind of started studying a bit more seriously that there's little pockets of kind of real interest in terms of national identity and politics and hubs of good sociological and political research. And Taiwan is one of those hubs, and there's a reason why. It's got a similar kind of critical position in terms of a challenge contested status. And it just becomes interesting to look at other corollaries to Scotland, where you've got this nationhood without it necessarily being statehood, and how the different dynamics play out in those different contexts. Then Ren-Shiang reached out to me when he was coming across to study Scotland as part of his study, and we had a long conversation about his project, about the similarities and differences, and it just kind of put that little seed in the head about the fact there are some comparative interesting points to unpick here. I wanted to learn more about it. I know yourself, Anne, have done lots of work in Southeast Asia and in the Pacific area around similar interests and topic areas. So when the funding opportunity came up, and myself and Ren-Shiang were kind of collaborating together, there was natural synergies in terms of the work that we've already done, the collaborations that have been built before. But I don't think without the support and the funding of the network, we would have actually come to anything tangible. And that's the real benefit of the network in terms of really kind of being a catalyst for that.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to jump ahead in the order of questions that I had in mind, just to find out what the two of you thought you would find out by doing this collaborative work. You know, you've now both explained to some extent how you came to be doing it, but what were your expectations? Because I always wonder about anything that's comparative. Are you expecting to find similarities, or are you also expecting that you're going to find a lot of big differences as well? I'll start with you, Ren-Shiang. Did you expect to find similarities?
I think we did agree that we've already found some similarities. So as a consequence, I think sports is regarded in both countries, I mean Taiwan and Scotland, as an important vehicle for establishing and promoting distinctive identity. And also, I think in Scotland, the political culture is different from that of England. Yeah, I think that means winning medal is important, but more attention is probably paid to the social benefit of sports for all, for etc. So, but I also found that there's a differences. I think in Taiwan still focus. I think in the government level we still focus on the winning medal. We put I think more than 80% of budget for elite sport. But from the policy paper of Scotland, I think Scottish government, I think they started from obesity problem. So I feel that they focus more on the sports for all or sports participation level. So that's so far I found it's really interesting to compare.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about that, Stuart? I mean, similarities and differences.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think one of the reasons for the Catalyst project was I believe there were some similarities there without ever really thinking it was going to be a direct comparison that you can say these are just the same kind of processes, the same policies in different contexts. Culturally, there's different, as Ren-Shiang just kind of outlined there. Almost the start point of policy goals are very different too. Also, the relationship. I mean, you can't really compare the intensity or the heat of the political considerations between Scotland and England, the rest of the UK, as you can with Taiwan and China. I mean, there's a massive difference there. But there are enough similarities to kind of coax out some things which are, I guess, shared kind of beliefs about what sport can do, even if that is a little bit naive. So sport can promote this distinct and kind of unique identity, which is kind of papering over the cracks of two divided nations within Taiwan and Scotland there. There's not a kind of homogenous Taiwanese or Scottish identity. But even the fact that that is the case is interesting in itself. So you almost have similar patterns emerging across there, which manifest themselves in different ways. I think that's what's really interesting. What kind of excited me with the project was to kind of see where the similarities or similar kind of ideals exist. And even the fact that Taiwan were interested in what Scotland are doing in sport policy, I found very interesting in the first instance. And you can see why, but equally, you can't just take what happens in one context and apply it in another one because there's so many considerations. The messiness is what I think is interesting from an academic perspective.
Thanks. I mean, I just picking up on that and something before that Ren-Shiang said. I mean, do you think it's true, Stuart, that in Scotland there is more of an emphasis on participation and sport for all than there might be in England or the UK as a whole?
I think there is. I mean, I think that's the start point probably from the Scottish government is that they want to kind of tackle kind of public health outcomes. They want to use it to tackle mental health, physical health, and like life expectancy and things along those lines. So I think there is that bit more of a start point in terms of where they say the goal is. I think what's problematic though is if you actually follow the funding, whether it be the government funding or the lottery funding, that does still get to be swallowed up by elite level and kind of elite sports with this kind of trickle down belief that if we have these role models and we fund elite sports, that naturally we're going to inspire young people, inspire people to take part in sport. So the same naivety, which I think impacts upon not just Scottish sport policy, but broader sport policy in the Western world. And I think also, as Ren-Shiang has kind of flagged his discussions also in Taiwan, that is still the case. So the start goal is still to tackle health outcomes, I believe, but sometimes that's not done directly. And where the funding goes to doesn't always kind of make sense or square that circle to do that in an effective way.
No, and Ren-Shiang in Taiwan then, I mean, you seem to be suggesting that winning medals possibly is still more important than participation, physical activity, public health. Would that be true of Taiwan?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what you mean. You mean we still focus on that?
Yeah, that you're still in Taiwan, the government and the policy makers are more interested in medals than in the public health issues.
Yeah, I think that's quite complicated for the policymakers if they want to do some public health things linked to the sport, because I think there are two kind of department of sport. I mean, sport affairs council. They all focus on, I think, 90%, 80% they use the funding to focus on the winning medals because that's a quantitative thing. You can judge the achievement by how many medals you got. But if they want to do some public health things, they have to cooperate with some, I think, Department of Health or Social Welfare to link with that to do some, I think, obesity or maybe aged people or disability things. So it's not easy for them to produce achievement. So I think that's another reason for them. But I think it's easier to triumph the winning of the medal or of the Olympic, not just we spend some funding and the people got more healthier. It's not easy to judge. So I think from these two levels, it's too difficult to use that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. It is always a difficult balance, this one, and we know the ideas of the virtuous circle of more participation, more future elite stars, more inspiration to young people. Winning medals is obviously important to most countries in the world, but also there's the hosting of important events. I mean, whether we call them mega events or simply multinational, international events. I mean, how important is that to Scotland, would you say, Stuart?
Yeah, I mean, I think for Scotland, it's been part of a kind of economic strategy, particularly in the West Scotland, particularly around Glasgow, to have a international, multinational sporting events, almost series across probably the last decade or so. The biggest one of that was the Commonwealth Games. I mean, Scotland doesn't have the scale to really do anything bigger than the Commonwealth Games. It couldn't do one of the megas, as you kind of stated there. But it's hosted the Commonwealth Games. It hosted games for the football, the Men's European Championships. It's hosted the gymnastics, athletics, lots of different things across time. I would actually say most of that event strategy is not necessarily focused upon participation. Commonwealth Games certainly was. That was much more about using that as a multi-sport event to tackle participation. But a lot of the other ones are much more about event hosting, economic and tourism generation, and part of almost using of the facilities that have been established, not just for the Commonwealth Games, but for events hosting such as the Hydro in Glasgow and things along those lines. But because of that, there's only so many events you can have. There's only so much traction you can have. And it seems to be there's a bit of a diminishing return in terms of how the status they're able to kind of continue maintaining there. So I think those events are going to be shorter terms in terms of their impact, and I focus more on economics than I think the broader public health goals that the Scottish Government have traditionally looked at.
Okay, thanks. Now, Ren-Shiang, I know that in the case of Taiwan, it's often been quite difficult for cities in Taiwan to host mega events or major sports events because often of the intervention of China or mainland China with competing bids. What's the current situation? I mean, how successful has Taiwan been in attracting these multinational sporting events?
Yeah, I think what you mentioned about the intervention of China, I think is already proved by some academic papers. But I think for the mega events, it's quite important. I think in the parliament debate or the political report, they said, yeah, it's good for national identity. It's kind of like the commercial for Taiwan. But I think actually the things now is good. I think sports people use that to be a booster for sports development. I mean, you can climb because the mega event or international event means it's linked to politics. So you get involved. The politician will get involved. So you can decline the budget, and like what Stuart said, you can enhance your facility things. So I think it's quite complicated. It's not just easy to say like the old time use that as a identity things, but now it's kind of you have to link or cooperate with business side and also the development side. But what my observation is that the participation seems not the important things for the mega event hosting. I think that seems ignored. But people, because of its Chinese Taipei team or Taiwanese team, people will tend to attend that. But I think the people who host that is not really concerned about the participation perspective in international things. Yeah.
No. Okay, thanks. Yeah, I mean, that raises an interesting thing. I mean, you host these events, and often we hear the arguments that sport unites nations or brings people together around a shared identity. I mean, I wonder how unifying is sport, for example, in Scotland, Stuart?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends upon the sport you're talking about. The main sport in Scotland, being football, is divisive ultimately. Well-rehearsed and well-versed debates between the Old Firm, Rangers and Celtic, and the divide along those lines in terms of Catholicism and Protestantism, and those two clubs being the main hegemonic force within Scottish football, and then also more kind of regional and city-based debates elsewhere in Scotland. So if you take the main sport of football, actually it can be quite divisive. And even though you have a Scottish international team, interestingly, some of the followers of other clubs, such as Rangers Celtic, don't necessarily support Scotland in a wholehearted way. So that even that element of it isn't really unifying. Then if you then look at other major international sports where Scotland have a representative team, they maybe only have a following from particular demographics. So rugby union, for example, is probably the second in terms of its status, but a very middle class and upper class sport, followed by people from privately educated backgrounds and higher social class backgrounds, often in the borders in the Edinburgh region. And there's maybe a different type of Scottish identity being portrayed in rugby. Then if you then take any of the sports within the Commonwealth Games, you will get a support, a groundswell from Scottish people behind them, but it's a particular group of Scottish people. There's not really a single solidifying, unifying force which people can unionise or can unite around, if that makes sense. Then we have the divide between Scotland and then GB, and even as a proud Scotsman myself, when we come to the Olympics or events involving Great Britain, I will still be pleased when Great Britain win gold medals, even though that might not be a Scottish achievement. Scottish achievements might be valorised more than, say, English or Welsh or Northern Irish achievements. So sport has got this kind of dual symbolism in Scotland, and then it's divisive even within Scotland, I guess.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's really interesting. And of course, there are divisions in Taiwan as well. I mean, obviously between the two supporters of the two main political parties, and also the fact of the indigenous population and so on. So two questions, Ren-Shiang. One, how unifying is sport in Taiwan? Does it bring everyone together, regardless of what their political views are or their ethnicity? And Stuart said about sort of liking to see British athletes or competitors do well in the Olympics. Do people in Taiwan celebrate the achievements of Chinese athletes in the Olympics?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I will answer the first one. I think the sport do unify people in Taiwan, but that's a small portion of Taiwanese people, because I think the culture of Taiwan and Scotland is quite different. Is that in Taiwan, I think people who is a sports fan is not a big part of population. So it's but in that field, when I think like baseball game or basketball game, or something happened, I think people is quite unified. Yeah, but I think there's one premises with that, because I do believe that I think Taiwan's national sports is winning. It's not baseball or basketball or gymnastics or something. It's winning. When you can win in something in the international level, people try to triumph as a group. Yeah, but in terms of China's successful winning, I don't think at the moment people will celebrate that. I really don't think people will say, we are the same. Because even people who really think that they like to see the Chinese people to win the medals, but they won't really say that. They won't express that. So they just put in heart, or just something like they don't really say it. So in the surface, I don't think people will like Stuart said, when Team GB wins, we celebrate. So.
Yeah, so and that's about fans, of course, sports fans, and we know in Scotland they were once described as 90-minute patriots, and maybe the baseball fans in Taiwan could be the 9 innings patriots. But what about the athletes? How politically engaged are they in Taiwan, Ren-Shiang?
People in Taiwan tend to say sports is sports, politics is politics. But we all know that's not true, but we will use that as the first slogan. So like what I mentioned, I think actually try not to express what he like, even maybe he wants to support unification or wants to support Taiwan's independence. So I don't think the athlete will really express the political orientation when he is the current athlete. But I think retired athlete will try to do that. I think that's so far what I observed.
Did athletes get involved in the referendum debate about changing the name of the sports teams from Chinese Taipei to Taiwan?
Yes, I know what you mentioned, but I think that's because if you said, I'm not quite sure that's true or not, but we've been told if we don't use Chinese Taipei, the name, so the athlete might not attend the Olympics because the progress of the changing names. So I don't think it's a punishment, but I think it's a progress to takes longer to do that. So the athlete will say that I don't want to lose my 4 years training period because of I say I support the things. So I think what they try to support is support what they can represent. So if that's Taiwan, so they're okay to represent, but at the moment it's Chinese Taipei. I think that's a kind of the things they have to accept. So they won't really express that.
Okay, thanks. And finally, I think, Stuart, what about the Scottish sports people? How politically engaged are they?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it echoes Ren-Shiang's points about a more greater willingness for retired athletes to speak out during the independence referendum and state their opinion. But that didn't necessarily preclude some athletes. So Andy Murray came out on the yes side, and there were other kind of athletes who are kind of in this Sport for Yes group. But the majority of current athletes, big hitters like Sir Chris Hoy, Lindsay Sharp, kind of spoke out in favour of the status quo of staying within the union. And a lot of that resonates with Ren-Shiang's points about concerns about access to funding, training facilities, the Olympic team, what that might mean, and kind of dealing with the uncertainties of it. whilst I think that sport and politics doesn't mix thing does still exist, I think recently, though, we started to see that people are more willing to put their neck on the line about causes. Those causes could be about politics. Often it's about kind of identity politics, whether it be LGBT rights, Black Lives Matter and whatnot. And I think that's a welcome change. I think people and academics have argued for a long time that sport and politics do mix. I can see why athletes are hesitant to do so, but I think other people have emboldened them in that way. Also, equally, I think Scottish society is divided. And Ren-Shiang made the point earlier on about sports people not being a major element or a major part of that. There's been bigger conversations had in the society about what Scottish future would be. Sports is a tiny part of that, and we've now got a very politically active element of Scottish society. So sports importance as a mark of identity has probably declined across time in comparison to other factors, which is probably fairly welcome too.
Right, thanks very much, Stuart. And can I thank you both for joining me today? I mean, it's become very apparent just in the course of our discussion that this particular project is generating a lot of interesting information, insights, stressing comparison, similarities, but also identifying differences. And I wish you well with the rest of your study, and thanks very much for taking part in the podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.